Hello, everybody. We are just finished hearing from Professor Douglas Horsford, Provost Rowley, and former Secretary of Education, Dr. John King. They framed the issue of inequality really well, and now we're going to move on to a panel of experts to talk more about this topic from a wide range of perspectives. This approach, looking at the same topic from a lot of different lenses, is a hallmark and strength of Teachers College. My name is Lillian Mongeau. I'm the Senior Editor and Western Bureau Chief at the Hechinger Report. The Hechinger Report is a small newsroom that covers education, and it's based at Teachers College, though we typically have sort of a firewall between us and everybody else. So it's really fun to be able to be on this panel today and meet some of my colleagues. I also want you to know briefly the Hechinger Report is just thehechingerreport.org. You can check it out yourself. It is a great resource for stories about inequality in education. We cover education from preschool all the way through university, and every angle you can think of, we include in there. Before we get started on this panel on inequality, you may have noticed that I'm white. That is a thing these days, to think about who is talking about inequality and why. And I just wanted to say that I think this is a topic everyone has a professional responsibility to engage in. And I think that there's a really big difference between engaging in a topic and claiming expertise. So I am moderating this panel, but I do so with the utmost humility and look forward to what everyone on the panel has to say about their experiences and their research on the topic of inequality, among other things that they're looking into. Also, as you're hearing already today, and if you don't already know this, inequality has been baked into public education from the very beginning. So to not talk about inequality when you talk about public education is really to sort of, miss the forest for the trees. At the Hechinger Report, we say that we cover inequality and innovation, and our favorite topics, our favorite cross-section of those two things is when innovation is actually addressing inequality. And that's something that all of the people on the panel today have looked into ways to do, using innovative techniques to address inequality in the various fields that they're studying. So with that, I will stop talking, and we're going to move on to introducing our panel. After I introduce them, we're going to ask a few group questions, and then I'll send some questions out to each person so that you can get a better sense of the kinds of things that these folks at TC study. I was going to say cover because I'm a journalist and that's how we talk about the topics, but the things that these folks study, and they could tell you a little more about that. So without further ado, Dr. Yolanda Sealey-Ruiz, if you could introduce yourself.
Sure. Hello, everyone. And we want to welcome you to Teachers College, and thank you for considering us and deciding that for those of you who will be enrolling, will be with us. My name is Dr. Yolanda Sealey-Ruiz. I'm an associate professor of English education here at Teachers College. And my area of expertise is racial literacy, and most recently, the archaeology of the self in education.
And Yolanda, I meant to remind everyone at the beginning, I wanted to say also, just to bring it home to the moment, have everyone say who they're quarantining with. So I'm quarantining with my toddler, my infant, and my husband. It's a pretty full house.
Yes, I have a full house too. I'm quarantining with my mom, who is over in her 80s, my daughter, who is almost 16, and my two cats. It's a full house.
Great, thank you. Moving on to the next person, Dr. Sonali Rajan.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here today, and welcome to all of our new students. We are thrilled that you are joining us virtually for the moment and eventually in person, and we're so looking forward to this upcoming academic year. So my name is Dr. Sonali Rajan. I'm an associate professor of health education in the Department of Health and Behavior Studies here at Teachers College. And I study primarily school health issues, and in particular school violence. So I study gun violence, youth experiences with trauma in various forms, and the role of schools in mitigating these kinds of experiences for young children, and how that then connects to their ability to learn and to engage academically in their classrooms and with their peers. So really trying to draw that connection between education and public health. And up until this past Monday, we had been quarantining on my husband's family's farm with my husband, his twin brother, my sister-in-law, my son, and my niece and my nephew. So now we are back home in New York City. We're really happy to be home. And so now there's just one kid here, but you might hear him, in which case it'll sound like so I apologize in advance for that. So anyway, really nice to see everybody, and thank you again for having me here today.
Thank you. And Dr. Kimberly Noble.
Thank you, Lillian, and welcome everyone. We're so thrilled to welcome you to Teachers College, and I really look forward to a very stimulating semester. Even if we are remote, we know that it's going to be tremendously valuable, and we're going to learn a lot from you and hope to engage with you as well. I'm a professor of neuroscience and education in the Department of Biobehavioral Sciences and Human Development here at Teachers College. I'm a neuroscientist and pediatrician by training, and I study how social and economic inequality relates to children's cognitive, emotional, and brain development, particularly in early childhood.
Great, thank you. And last but not least, Dr. Chris Emdin, who wins the prize for the best background.
Hey everyone, I'm Chris Emdin. Welcome to TC. We're so excited to have you. I'm a faculty in the program in science education and also work with the Institute for Urban and Minority Education. My work is in and around science education, culture and education, hip hop and education, and creating new tools for educators to be able to engage with young folks to address inequities when it comes to STEM, but also education writ large. Oh, and I'm quarantining with the whole fam. So with my best friend, Eb, and with my babies, Sydney and Malcolm.
Great, thanks. And yeah, you have your 2 kids at home too,
yes,
right?
I realized I forgot to mention, I'm here with my husband and my 2 daughters, 8 and almost 6, who hopefully will play nicely during this time.
Great. Well, thank you all for being here. We're going to start with a group question. So this will be a few sentences from each of you. I know these stories can sometimes be, you want to spend more time on them than we probably have. So let's just keep it tight. I want to get everyone a sense of where you're coming at from this. But if each of you could share an experience either from childhood or as a professional that most firmly brought home for you what inequality means and why it's an important thing to keep in mind in your work. And I guess I'll call on people since we're in, usually I don't do that, but since we're in Zoom, I think it's a little easier. So Sonali, let's start with you.
Sure. Okay. I'll try to keep this short. I tend to talk a lot, so you can tell me if I'm going off. So I did my undergraduate, did my undergraduate at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York, and I actually studied bioengineering. So something very far removed from the work I'm doing now. But I took a class my senior year, an education class to fulfill a random requirement that the university expected. And it was a year-long course where the first semester was all about learning theory and better understanding different aspects of public education. But in the spring semester of my senior year, and this actually completely changed my career trajectory by taking this class and having this experience, they placed every one of us students in a school in and around rural Ithaca. And so for 16 weeks, every single Tuesday and Thursday, I got up at the crack of dawn and drove far, far away out, about an hour away, to a very small public school in rural Ithaca, near rural Ithaca, and spent about 2 hours every morning providing support to classroom teachers in an under-resourced school. And it was my first time really seeing what inequality and a lack of resources within a public school system looks like up close. And like I said, it completely changed and shaped my long-term trajectory. So that's part of the way in which I ended up in the work and space I'm doing now.
It's really interesting. Thanks for sharing that. Okay, Dr. Yolanda. Dr. Yolanda.
Sure. First of all, thank you for that question. And it's a question that I think I want to answer in retrospect, that I now have the language, because I didn't have the language for it when I was younger. And my South Bronx community nurtured me, loved me. I would not have want to been raised anywhere else. But I knew as I got older, and maybe at that time too, that there was something different, that there were only Black and Latinx folks in my community, that there would, the South Bronx was burning for a period of 10 years because the landlords, as more Black and Latinos moved in, the landlords, who were predominantly Jewish and Italian, would burn down their properties so that they could collect money and move to a different neighborhood. And those properties would remain burned. And that's when I knew that there was something different, that there was no one coming really to change the landscape of my community. We were talked about very horribly in the media. I remember the movie Bonfire of the Vanities that made it look like we were living in a war zone. And so I knew that there was something unequal, right, about the way folks in my community were represented, even if I just looked at other movies and looked in the media. And then, of course, as I got older and as a researcher, I began to have the language to know that my community was purposely underfunded in multiple ways because of the deep racism in society towards folks who look like me and others. So that is both something I think I realized in my teens, but had the language for in my 20s and 30s.
And I think it's important that you mentioned purposely. I mean, and there's something to be said for that for the school that Sonali was in too. Like a lot of the reasons there's inequity, it is on purpose. Like when you look at the policies that are in place that govern schools, especially, and every other aspect of life, really, but the schools are what I know the most about. You know, a lot of it is more purposeful than I think you know before you kind of start digging in, and that's something that you know, a few years at TC you'll be more clear on. Kimberly, could you share your experience?
Certainly, and I thank you as well for the question. So my experience is a small moment that happened one summer when I was in college. I was volunteering at a summer camp at a housing project in Philadelphia. And it was one of the first moments I remember recognizing my white privilege, although echoing Yolanda, not having the words at that point to talk about it in that way. So I was volunteering at this summer camp, and so it was a summer camp for young kids, but of course there were siblings and teens who were around and sometimes did activities with us. And I remember talking with one teenager who lived in the housing project, who was towards the end of her career in high school. And she told me she wanted to be a lawyer when she grew up. But talking with her a bit more, found out that she, didn't really know anything about taking the SAT or how to apply to college. And I reflected upon the fact that that kind of information had really been handed to me and expected of me in a way, whether I would take the SAT, whether I would go to college wasn't even in question. It was part of my, as far as I understood it, predetermined path. And so growing up in that environment, knowing that so many people had handed me opportunities and expectations compared to this young girl who had dreams and aspirations for herself, but no one had really given her the pathway to get there, was really striking.
Yeah, thank you for that. And Chris.
Yeah, man, I think for me, similar to Yoli, just coming up in the Bronx, as a teenager, when I started high school, I got the opportunity to take a test and then get admitted into a specialized high school. And what that meant was that I got to travel to Brooklyn, New York every day, while my friends that I grew up with stayed in the Bronx. And so I had a very interesting experience at Brooklyn Tech where I had access to a foundry. I got to do hands-on stuff. We had to pick a major by 10th grade. And then all my best friends who were back home at the local schools just didn't have the same experiences. And so I'd be coming back describing, the kind of opportunities I was provided. And then I'd go back home to realize that the young folks who look just like me, who were just as smart as me, who just happened not to take the test or have the opportunity to take it, were having an awful experience. And at that point, I realized that something wasn't right about the experience. And at the same time, I started realizing that because I came from where I came from and traveled to that school, there were perceptions about my ability, my genius, what I had the capability to do. And so I realized, wait, I tested to get in here, so I'm worth it to get here. And you're looking at me like I don't have the opportunity. So it's this interesting survivor's guilt that I had by being able to go into that school, but also being viewed like I was being less than because I didn't come through the proper channels to get into that school. And at that point, the bevy of emotions that I was experiencing let me understand what inequity looked like or felt like.
That's really powerful. Thank you, Chris. And what's interesting is that all of these experiences in some ways do come back to schools and learning. I know that everybody's not studying just education policy on this panel, which is one of the interesting things about the group of us here. But, what Kim mentioned could be maybe fixed by a better school counseling policy, right? Like we don't have enough school counselors generally. This is something we've written a lot about in the Hechinger report, to make sure kids are given the information they need to apply to college if that's the path they want to pursue. That thing of like test in schools that Chris experienced, that's something especially that's happening in New York City, but across the country there are examples of that. And it's usually an attempt to equalize things, but it often doesn't equalize things. It causes a lot of problems as well as causing, offering solutions. So I think that that's another thing, is that solutions also cause problems often. And so it's important to just be nuanced about how we look at all these things. So I'm going to go to each person individually a little bit here. Chris, let's just go right back with you. One of the things you've worked a lot with is this hashtag hip hop ed. I don't even know exactly what to call it. It's almost a movement now, but can you tell us a little bit more about hip hop ed?
Yeah, hip hop ed is a online. It began online to sort of bring folks who are in the hip hop community and the education community together to look at the intersections of hip hop and education and find ways that hip hop can transform the nature of education, but also to look at what is educative about hip hop, and to allow it to not just be a conversation with scholars and professors, but also students and hip hop artists, community members, people who are just listeners to hip hop music, breakdancers, but to create a space where there's some democracy around troubling what is wrong with both the idea of hip hop being separate from education. And I just want to talk really quickly about something you said about solutions. I think solutions that are constructed without confronting the fact that certain communities are not allowed to create their own solutions actually becomes an exercise in allowing those who have privilege to feel as though they've done something, when in reality, they're only creating something to allow certain folks to historically remain marginalized. And so I always talk about this idea of, not rescue missions, but restitution. So this idea of I'm not rescuing them by creating solutions, but I'm providing back to them what I have robbed them of. Restitutions over rescue missions erases the idea of creating solutions for communities without involving communities and how their own problems can be solved, or also the problems that have been created by other folks can be solved.
Yeah, what was that phrase you just used? I'm restoring to people what I have robbed them of. I think that's really something. One question I have that kind of builds on that, Chris, is where you talk about culturally relevant education a lot in this hip hop ed movement. And I'm wondering, especially if you're white coming into this, where does culturally relevant education end and cultural appropriation in education begin? Should a white teacher who's not familiar with hip hop go in and say, "Oh, I've written a rap about, Shakespeare"?
Yeah, that's a brilliant question. And although I have a lot to say about that, Professor Sealey-Ruiz is so much more brilliant in her articulation of what appropriation looks like, particularly with her work around archaeology of the self. So I'm going to defer to her because she's so much more insightful than I am on that topic.
Okay, Yolanda.
Wow.
You've been asked a question you weren't ready for.
No, but that's okay, because this is what it's about. It's about thinking together and being together, and it's going to take all of us, right, to move this needle forward. And Chris, I thank you for that, not just the confidence, but for the acknowledgement of the work that I've been doing lately. And you're right. It really is about the archaeology of the self, in the sense of doing a deep self-excavation of where this lies. I think part of the issue in teacher education, not just that the teacher education programs should be doing more to engage people in archaeology of the self. We're trying to offer solutions. We're trying to say, this is the pedagogy that you need to do. And once you do that, that's great. But if it doesn't set in your heart, if it's not something that you truly believe in, if it's not an investment that you're making after you find where do these issues of homophobia, racism, all of this and bias live within you, and you do that excavation and replace it, I suggest you replace it with critical love, you're just performing professional learning. And so I think we have to shift that question, if you don't mind, Lillian, and not really, first of all, centering it specifically on white teachers, but this is a human endeavor. And it's about moving towards our full humanity. And folks who go into teaching are going to have to ask, what is blocking me from being fully human with the students who are in front of me, and for me seeing them as fully human? That takes some deep, sustained work, not that you'll get in a PD session or even in your teacher education program. That's a lifetime endeavor. And so for me, this idea of the archaeology of the self is just that. Do the self work, be in community with folks. I would suggest perhaps your white brothers and sisters first, and then reach out to networks of people of color. But you have to do that work first and not expect answers to come externally. Does that make sense?
Can you tell me a
I
little
love
bit
that.
more
It's
about...
like you don't get stuck on appropriation. if it's about deep excavations, right? Like you don't get stuck in, you know, how am I replicating something that somebody else gave me if I'm always consistently being reflective about the process. And that's why I defer to you.
Yeah, and it's a total reframing. Thank you. We have to reframe, I think, the questions, reframe the thinking, and start with the self.
And can you tell me a little bit more when you say self-archaeology, like tell me a little bit more about what that means.
Sure. Really quickly, archaeology of the self is one of the 6 components of this theory I've been playing with around racial literacy development. And at the foundation of racial literacy development is critical love. It's having a deep respect and care and ethical commitment to the communities that we're serving, right? What's also part of that development is the idea of critical reflection, which Chris just mentioned, critical humility, understanding that you are likely racially illiterate and you need to work on your racial literacy. The idea of having historical literacy. I am encouraged and inspired by Dr. Ibram Kendi and Dr. Khalil Gibran Muhammad, who talked about historical literacy. And then, of course, there's archaeology of the self, that you're doing that deep work to figure out, how did I first learn this racist idea, this sexist idea? Where did it come from? How do I perpetuate it? And once you're able to locate that, then you move towards the interruption, which is what I am suggesting we all have to do. Racial literacy development is an active model that once you see something and you know something, you have to move towards the dismantling of it. So that interruption piece and the practice of interrupting these inequitable systems as we experience them through the things that we hear and see is moving towards and forward in our racial literacy.
That's really, thank you. One of my questions was, what is racial literacy? So you've just answered that one. You're just answering my questions before I've even asked them. So thank you. I'm going to jump to Kim, a project that she's working on right now that it works on trying to interrupt some of these things at the very, very beginning of the process for young children. Kim, can you tell us a little bit about that work?
Sure. So along with a team of social scientists and neuroscientists from around the country, I'm one of the leaders of the Baby's First Years Project, which is the first clinical trial of poverty reduction in early childhood in the US. So the premise is pretty simple. In the spring of 2018, we began recruiting 1,000 low-income mothers shortly after they gave birth in a number of hospitals around the United States. Upon enrolling in the study, moms were randomized to be in one of 2 groups. All moms in the study receive a monthly unconditional cash gift. So a cash amount administered via debit card that they're free to spend however they like. And they get that monthly gift every month for the first 40 months of their children's lives, so till just after their children turn 3. But again, they're randomized into one of 2 groups. One group gets a large monthly cash gift of $333 a month, which amounts to $4,000 a year. The other group gets a nominal cash gift of $20 a month or $240 a year. That difference in the social science literature has been associated with improved test scores, improved cognitive and social emotional development, and even some evidence for improved health in adulthood when kids grow up. But nobody's done it in sort of an experimental design, randomized controlled trial way. So, there are plenty of naysayers who would say, well, it's not whether you grew up in poverty, but whether you're willing to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, for example. And you might say, well, babies don't have bootstraps. But regardless, the way to truly test it in a randomized scientific way is to do randomized controlled trial design. And so that's exactly what we're doing. And we're following the impact of poverty reduction on children's cognitive, emotional, and brain development in the first 3 years of life, which is the very time that neuroscientists believe that the developing brain is most malleable to experience. And so in that first year, we recruited the moms. We just finished our measuring impacts at age 1. So I don't have data to share with you yet. Those are hot off the presses, and we are in the midst of analyzing those data as we speak. We're going to be following up again with the families at age 2 and at age 3 so that hopefully we'll have some definitive evidence as to the impact of poverty reduction on early childhood development.
So I write about early childhood quite a lot. Oh, sorry, Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, I just think that Kim's work's really, really interesting and intriguing. And I think one of the things that we also want to really think about in the context of that kind of work and that I try to do on my work is also recognize that the young folks, poor Black folks, who don't even have access to those kind of nominal gifts to measure the impact, come out of the womb with a certain kind of natural expressive genius that occurs irregardless of the financial context or the provisions. And I think this is the interesting piece that I want folks to understand. And when we talk about inequity, it's about the absence of resources, but it's also in the absence of the perception about those young folks as coming from lack as a function of socioeconomic circumstances that are not the same as others, right?
Right.
Absolutely, I agree 100%.
Genius, even without money.
Absolutely.
And that there are impacts on having money on certain things in their lives, but by function of being born with Black and brown skin, even in poor conditions, there are forms of genius that get generated out of those contexts. And it's like looking at Black and brown babies through the lens of that inherent genius that allows us to be able to overcome these kind of conversations around inequity that we are having down the line.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, it's very clear that inequity is comprised of many different inputs. And I think economic resources are one of those inputs. They happen to be one that we can sort of test in an easy way, right? It's much easier to give people different amounts of money than provide different amounts of education, for example, in a sort of controlled experimental design. And so for that reason, it's promising. It's also one that can be implemented in policy in a relatively straightforward way. But it's very clear that reducing poverty alone is just one aspect of the many sides of inequity and inequality.
Absolutely.
And if I may, and I'm so grateful for my colleagues and Chris, you engaging with Kim and the important work that you've done. And again, I want to go back to the self, because doing that work, policymakers, researchers, folks who do this kind of work, they have to do their own self-excavation around these biases. And so if that's not done, we will continue to have, and you'll see some studies replicated, you'll see policies that continue to move forward. That reframing is important, but that's why I say it has to start with the self, because there are individuals behind research studies, individuals behind policy, and I want to get at the heart and the root of the individuals, right? And yes, starting with genius, as my best friend Goldie Muhammad would say, is such a powerful, powerful thing, particularly when it comes to Black and brown children.
And for those who are watching this, right, this is TC. Like, I know this is about inequity, but I think this is what makes, us, right? That we different. We push lightly, we affirm, we support, and we become so much more learned based on this, right? Like, out of Kim's work, like, I'm so excited to see what the outcome of her next phase of her research is. Like, I want to go hang out with her now and ask her more questions. And I think this is the beauty of, what we do as an institution. And I think even connecting this work to Sonali's brilliant work around violence and the implications and long-term and gun violence, right? These things are so closely intertwined, because the experiences of the babies that Kim is working with right now and our experiences working with them in adolescence, right, connects back to the impacts of violence in their lives that occurs brilliantly in Sonali's work that I would love to have her talk about.
Yeah, and we're going to go there next. I just want to say, I think the other thing that is so interesting about what Kim is studying goes back to something Yolanda said earlier about the purposefulness of inequality. So one of the reasons, poverty exists for some babies is because of policy. To think that it's just like, oh, some people, those poor people are poor is not quite right either. If there was a different minimum wage, for example, that alone would change the poverty level. If people weren't paying for healthcare out of their pocket, that would change the poverty level. So to think that these things aren't connected to policy is really missing the point. And those policies have been put in place on purpose, and a lot of people who put them in place knew exactly what they were doing, which is, I think that's what I've learned as a reporter that I didn't know as a kid, right? Like, the more you look into it, you're like, oh, they knew that they were doing that. And so it's really interesting to see. It'll be really interesting to see what happens here. If you just change that baseline, this one input, what happens, and how much more of that innate genius is allowed to flourish just because of that one change.
If I could just follow up real quickly on what Chris said about Teachers College. I mean, the fact that we're all coming from these different disciplinary lenses and able to have this conversation about this topic, I think is really incredible and speaks to, the fruitful engagements that you guys will be able to have even virtually. And once we're back in person, Chris, I would love to hang out.
Right now it would have to be like a very structured hangout. Okay, and then Sonali, let's go to you. One of the questions I had for you, I know you study violence in schools and some ways to change that. We often have this view of violence in schools as, on the one hand, lone white boys usually with a gun. That's one kind of violence in schools. And then we talk about the supposedly other kind of violence in schools, and we think of rowdy Black kids in gangs. And those are two sort of structures that we have narratives of in the US. And I'm sure there's a lot more to be said about why that is. And my question for you is, what is missing from that sort of simplified narrative of violence in schools?
Well, we're missing, and I'm laughing because it's like, we really all are like friends, and that's like honestly the best part about being a faculty here at TC. Like I was saying to one of our other colleagues the other day, I was like, I can't wait to hug you in person because I feel like that's so much of like how the community here is. So anyway, so yeah, I'm joining your hangout, you guys, when this is all over. I've invited myself. Yeah, okay, so I honestly, Lillian, I could probably talk all day about this because there's so much missing from the narrative, and part of it is, yes, the ways in which the media has highlighted certain aspects of violence, and in particular gun violence. So the way we frame mass shooting as a mental health issue when it is a lone white perpetrator versus thinking of it as a domestic terrorism issue, which it is often, or talking about Black and brown boys as being thugs and using language around that, when in fact we don't look at the root causes or the mental health component of their experience. And so we are missing everything, honestly, from that conversation. And gun violence in particular is historically deeply, deeply underfunded as an area. And so I always sort of draw this comparison to the other public health issues that are not so politicized in this country and that have allowed us to bring researchers together in this way, interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary teams of researchers and practitioners, to think about creative solutions to various types of epidemics without drawing on racist, frankly, deeply racist, at times gendered narratives. So just for an example, let's talk about the obesity epidemic. Let's talk about how we as a country have thought about green space and vending machines in schools and access to parks and the genetics of it, and really looked at the prevention of obesity from the molecular level all the way on up through communities, through schools, through policy. And we're not sitting here and placing the blame, or we do to some degree, but we are thinking about the solutions to that epidemic in a creative way. Gun violence has not had its due in that case, and gun violence it's really an endemic. So that's an epidemic that is persisting, right? So it's not an emerging threat. It has been a threat for decades, and we see 100,000 people who are physically injured by a firearm every single year. This endemic disproportionately impacts communities of color. But at the same time, we also see rural white communities being disproportionately impacted by suicide by firearm. So we see communities who are struggling in various ways being impacted. We don't have those conversations. There has historically not been the resources devoted to thinking about creative solutions, evidence-informed solutions that actually allow us to see a child who chooses, and these are children, right? A 16-year-old brown boy who brings a gun into a school is a child. And so instead of talking about that child as a thug, or however we want to frame it in the language that we use, let's think about that child as part of their school, their community. And so the model that I use in my work, and this is not my model, it's a model that I've drawn on, but it's the whole school, whole community, whole child model. That is, we think about a child as an entire person. We think about supporting that child from the time they are in the womb all the way through their life. That is the responsibility of our communities. It is the responsibility of our schools, of our classrooms, in the ways in which we are criminalizing or choosing to criminalize school spaces. So, one of the areas of work, like I said, I could talk about this all day, but one of the areas of work, I'll say this one piece. One of the areas of work that my colleagues at the public health school here at Columbia and I are doing is really looking at school safety. So in the spirit of school safety, we have criminalized our school spaces. We have metal detectors. We have bulletproof backpacks. We have, I actually have a table on my desktop of about 49 different things that schools across the country are implementing in the spirit of trying to prevent gun violence. Very few of these actually have any scientific evidence, and we see them being used not just to prevent gun violence, and we don't know that many of them work, but we are also seeing how they are being used in punitive ways, particularly in communities of color, and particularly for Black and brown children, and in particular for Black and brown boys. And so we really do need to think about how we are, yes, I care deeply about the prevention of gun violence, but we need to think about how we are actively contributing to solutions that don't cause further harm to communities and to schools and to children, and to the teachers and educators who are part of that community as well. So this is when I saw the question, when you posed the question earlier, it's like, we are missing everything. And I think it is these kinds of conversations that are so critically important. The students who are part of this work, there are endless questions we can be asking and thinking about. We haven't for 25 years really had the resources to do that. And now we are starting to see those resources emerge, which has been incredible, an incredible win in many ways for survivors of gun violence, for researchers in this space. So I'm very optimistic actually about the work that will hopefully come in the years, following subsequent years. But yeah, this is deeply, deeply troubling. So sorry, I don't know if you answered your question. But
that's great. And I'm actually so we have about 10 minutes left, and I'm going to stay with you for a minute, Sonali, but then I want this to go to everybody. I know in your work, I know you're on the board of Girls on the Run, and really focused on some of the things kids can kind of do in real life, like the real concrete thing a kid could do differently and have things change. Can you tell me a little bit about like sort of where you've narrowed down to for here's something that we could maybe change concretely in schools for kids? And I'd love everyone to talk about that, because I know there's a lot of different elements.
So I think, like, when I think about prevention, so I have a public health and education training, so I kind of think about those together. But when we think about prevention of violence, it's really, we're choosing from a wide range, like a menu, right, of efforts that need to be implemented. A child doesn't just choose to find a firearm and then bring it to school. There has to be policies in place in which that firearm is accessible. There has to be a potentially destructive school climate that's contributing to their feeling isolated or excluded. There has to be potentially adverse childhood experiences that they have gone through that have been points and sources of trauma that they've experienced, a lack of access to mental health care and other forms of support. So there are so many things that have to come together to contribute to the long-term prevention of this kind of violence we see. And it isn't just, I worry that sometimes people say, oh, we'll pass this one policy and that'll, we checked the box and we took care of it. And it's actually so much more involved than that. But I would say, just from my lens of having spent a lot of time working with programming at school levels and working with teachers, I do believe firmly that a school's physical and social and emotional climate play a large role in the ways in which children feel like they belong. And I'm borrowing a little bit of language from one of my dear friends and colleagues of all of us, Lilita Vasudevan, who has talked a lot about the belonging. Where do children feel like they belong? And that is something that all of us who play a role in a school can contribute to doing. And there's ways in which we can attend to the well-being of children, and we can be better about how we do that. So I would say that, broadly speaking, is one area that doesn't cost very much. It's really about, to go back to Yolanda's beautiful work, it's really about ourselves and the way in which we are thinking about these children. And that, for me, is that sort of lens shapes a lot of my thinking.
Yeah. And that makes me think of, like, just in a really concrete way, like extracurriculars and sports alone have been shown to create a sense of belonging for kids. And in a lot of schools, those don't exist. And when they do exist, they exist unequally. So just a little tidbit there. I don't know. Let's see.
Yeah, if I may pop in real quick, because I'm fearful that I might lose power. But I want to say that the accumulation of unaddressed instances of symbolic violence will inevitably manifest itself as somebody enacting physical violence. And so the work of researchers and educators is to find instances of symbolic violence. Now, now these instances of symbolic violence are about not even microaggressions. I think that's powerful work, but I think it's about instances within institutions where your authentic self is being devalued and silenced and looked as less than. It constructs in the psyche of the individual a search for power. And within capitalist America, a search for power is oftentimes manifested as being able to enact violence on somebody less than, because it's the only way I know within this society to have power. And so when you start addressing instances where some young folks are not allowed to be their full selves, and they don't feel like they have to search for this sort of like awful, sort of like patriarchal, hyper-violent forms of power, then they find ways to be able to express their full selves in more robust ways. Part of my work around hip hop is just that. Like, why is certain hip hop hyper-misogynistic and hyper-violent? Because young Black boys who create that hip hop, all throughout their experiences in schools, are told that they're violent, they're messed up, and they can't be whole and full. And so they tell stories that and oftentimes are reflections of what you want to see in me. So we go back and sort of decolonize hip hop and recreate hip hop in ways that allow them to not just exert violence and power, but to be vulnerable and thoughtful and critical and academic. And all of a sudden, you start seeing new versions of the self emerge. Not new selves, but versions of the self that have been historically pushed down and trampled upon, allow those four more robust, more human selves, more humanistic selves, more loving selves to evolve. So the work in hip hop, in many ways, does the work of addressing violence by identifying moments of symbolic violence, redefining it, and then telling young folks that the violence that you're enacting is not who you are, but your response to your environment.
Wow.
Wow.
Beautifully said.
Yeah, and that makes me think, how important it is for everybody to realize that there's a narrative written about people who look like you. I mean, that makes me think of the Karen stuff, right? Because it's that same, it's like, white women are told, that they're good and that they can get away with anything, and that everybody, the what do they call it? The pretty girl discount, when you like smile and get the extra thing that like is not part of the policy. And recognizing that informs your view on the world, and that you can be exerting pressure downward on other people. And that's really just, it's a false power. It's because of the power that you yourself lack as well. And instead you're like, okay, well, I'll take what I do have and push it down. And I think that it's important to recognize, every part of society, no matter where you fall, you're viewed a certain way, and then you act in the world to some extent to act out that narrative. Yolanda, what would you like to say on this topic?
Oh, no, sure. I'll be really quick. My brilliant colleagues have said so much. Sonali, thank you for all that you shared, and in particular, bringing up Dr. Lalitha Vasudevan. And Chris, just thank you for being who you are and the presence that you have in my life as a colleague at TC. What I would like to see is a different type of professional learning and a different type of teacher education. I would like to see teacher education programs use explicit language of anti-racism, of anti-oppression. I would like to see that reflected in the people who are admitted in teacher education programs. I would like to see, once there's more diversity in teacher education programs, that again, there's not the symbolic violence that students often feel when they go through these experiences. And when it comes to professional learning in schools, I'd like to see schools, and I'm working with some school districts, and they're taking this language on, of being very explicit about many of the things that Sonali talked about, right? Having professional learning about how do we create a sense of belonging for the children in this school? How do we do, again, going back to doing the self-work, how do I look at myself as a teacher and excavate those things that are going to complicate or get in the way of me serving the students who are before me to my fullest human capacity? So I would like to see both changes in teacher education very deeply on policy levels, and then have that articulated in what professional learning should look like in schools.
Thank you. We've got 1 minute on the clock. We'll go a few seconds past that, but Kimberly, do you have one thing you'd like to add?
I guess I would just say that, if there would be one thing I wish teachers knew, it's that the developing brain, the developing mind are malleable by experience, right? So kids do not come to school pre-formed. They're very much shaped by their experiences, which means that their prior adversities shape how they behave, and that continuing adversities or changes to those adversities can have long-lasting and meaningful effects.
And I think, is it correct to say that it's also been found that positive experiences, not just adversities, also continue to shape and
Absolutely. So that's when I said changes to adversities or reduction in adversity can be profound.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to hear way more from all of you. Thank you so much for being part of this panel today. I really have been honored to be your moderator. I hope that all of you guys coming in to school here have a chance to meet these folks in person, and there's a lot of other brilliant people at TC. I hope you sign up for the Hechinger report, read our free newsletter. And coming up next is Tom Bailey, who will be offering some final thoughts about inequality today. Thank you, everybody.